An elderly man, digging in his own backyard to install a simple garden sprinkler, hit something hard, buried deep in the soil. As he carefully cleared away the earth, he uncovered a large, cylindrical object with metal fins and a pointed nose cone. A lifelong space enthusiast, his heart soared. He thought he had found a lost piece of space history, a forgotten rocket. He excitedly called the authorities to report his incredible find. But when the first officers arrived and saw the object, their expressions immediately shifted from curiosity to pure, abject terror. This was not a rocket. It was something far more dangerous. And the man's quiet suburban home was about to become the center of a full-scale military evacuation. But before we start our story, smash that like button, make sure you're subscribed, and hit that notifications bell so you won't miss any of our new incredible stories. To understand how a man could find a military weapon buried in his backyard, we must first understand a hidden chapter of American history. During the Second World War, the United States underwent the most massive and rapid military mobilization in its history. To train millions of soldiers, build thousands of planes, and test countless new weapons, the government acquired vast tracts of land all across the country. Deserts, prairies, and forests were transformed into sprawling military bases, training camps, airfields, and, most importantly for our story, thousands of bombing and gunnery ranges. For several years, these sites were alive with the constant thunder of explosions and the roar of engines. Then, in 1945, the war ended. The nation demobilized just as quickly as it had mobilized. These thousands of temporary military sites were no longer needed. The government began the process of decommissioning them, a program that would create a dangerous and often invisible legacy that lasts to this day. This is the story of formerly used defense sites, or FUDS. In the rush to return to a peacetime economy, the cleanup of these former military lands was often incomplete. While large visible structures were removed, what was left behind, buried just beneath the surface, was often a different story. These sites were littered with unexploded ordnance, or UXO live artillery shells, mortar rounds, grenades, and buried bombs that had failed to detonate during training exercises. Over the decades, the government sold off much of this land to private developers. The land was cheap, and the post-war housing boom was in full swing. And so, entire suburban neighborhoods, with quiet streets, green lawns, and elementary schools, were built directly on top of these former bombing ranges. For the families who moved in, the violent history of the land they now called home was a complete and dangerously forgotten secret. Our story's protagonist is 84-year-old Harold Watson, a man whose life had been defined by a different kind of technological race. He had grown up in the 1950s and 60s, a child of the space race. He had watched with awe as Alan Shepard and John Glenn were launched into orbit, and he had sat glued to his television set in 1969 as Neil Armstrong took his first steps on the moon. He was a lifelong amateur astronomer and a space enthusiast, his garage filled with books on rockets and a well-used telescope. In his retirement, he found joy in simpler, more earthly projects. On this particular autumn day, he was working in his backyard, digging a trench for a new garden irrigation system. He had lived in this quiet suburban home for over 20 years. It was a peaceful place, the kind of neighborhood where the only sounds were the distant hum of a lawnmower and the laughter of children playing down the street. As he was digging the trench, his shovel struck something large and metallic with a loud, jarring clang. He initially assumed it was a large rock or perhaps an old, buried septic tank. He began to dig around the object to determine its size. As he cleared more and more dirt away, a strange and exciting possibility began to form in his mind. The object was long, cylindrical, and had what looked like stabilizer fins. As he cleared the front end, he saw it, a distinct, pointed nose cone. Harold's heart began to beat faster. It looked exactly like a small experimental rocket from the early days of the space program. Given the number of old Air Force bases in the region, the idea was not entirely impossible. He thought he had stumbled upon a genuine piece of aerospace history. Overjoyed, he rushed inside and called the local police department, not to report a danger, but to share a historical discovery. He excitedly explained to the dispatcher what he had found, suggesting that perhaps the local historical society or a museum might be interested in it. The dispatcher, though likely skeptical, followed protocol and said she would send a patrol car to take a look. A short time later, 2 local police officers arrived at Harold's home. Harold proudly led them to his backyard. The officers looked at the large metal object in the trench and then at each other. Their expressions were not of excitement. They were of pure, unadulterated alarm. They were not looking at a piece of a space rocket. As trained law enforcement officers, they recognized the distinct shape of military ordnance. One of the officers discreetly moved away and began speaking urgently into his shoulder radio, while the other officer politely but firmly asked Harold and his wife to go inside their house immediately. Harold, still confused, watched from his kitchen window as his quiet street was suddenly filled with the flashing lights of more police cars. They were not calling a museum, they were calling the bomb squad, and they were beginning to evacuate his entire neighborhood. The object in his garden was not a symbol of humanity's reach for the stars. It was a dark, dangerous relic of its capacity for destruction. As his quiet suburban street was transformed into a high-stakes emergency zone, Harold Watson watched in stunned silence from his living room window. The arrival of a large, armored military vehicle confirmed his worst fears. This was a bomb squad, a team of specialists from a nearby Air Force base. The Explosive Ordnance Disposal, or EOD, unit began to deploy their equipment with a calm, methodical precision that was both reassuring and terrifying. They used a remote-controlled robot to get a closer look at the object, its camera feeding back detailed images to a monitor in their command truck. The EOD team leader, after examining the images, came to Harold's door to explain the situation. What Harold had found, he explained, was not a space rocket. It was, in fact, an unexploded aerial bomb from the Second World War. But it wasn't just any bomb. It was an incredibly rare and historically significant piece of technology, one of America's very first smart bombs. To understand what was buried in Harold's garden, we must go back to the desperate technological race of the Second World War. As the war progressed, the U.S. Army Air Forces were facing a difficult challenge: how to accurately bomb small but strategically vital targets like bridges or railway lines from high-altitude bombers. Conventional dumb bombs were notoriously inaccurate, often requiring hundreds of bombs to be dropped just to hit a single, narrow target. The military needed a way to guide a bomb to its destination after it had been dropped. The solution they developed was a pioneering piece of technology called the Azon bomb. Azon was short for azimuth only. The device was a standard 1,000-pound general-purpose bomb, but it was fitted with a special, radio-controlled tail section. This tail had rudders that could steer the bomb left or right on its way down. The system was ingenious. A bombardier in the plane above would watch a flare on the back of the falling bomb and use a small joystick to transmit radio signals to the bomb's tail, guiding it towards its target. It was the great-grandfather of the modern laser-guided smart bombs that are used today. The Azon was primarily used with great success in the dense jungles of the China-Burma-India theater of the war, where it was instrumental in destroying key bridges and disrupting enemy supply lines. It was a top-secret piece of technology, a crucial advantage that the military was developing and testing at various secret sites across the United States. And as it turned out, Harold's quiet, peaceful neighborhood was built directly on top of one of those forgotten testing grounds. Back in the present, the bomb disposal team began the incredibly tense and dangerous process of making the 70-year-old weapon safe. After decades in the damp soil, the bomb's explosive compounds and its delicate detonator mechanism were highly unstable. The team used the robot to carefully clear the remaining soil from around the bomb. They then conducted a remote X-ray to examine its internal state. After several hours of painstaking work, they determined that the safest course of action was not to disarm it on sight, but to move it. They carefully attached a specialized harness to the bomb, and a crane slowly and gently lifted the 1,000-pound relic from the hole where it had slept for over 70 years. It was then placed in a special containment vessel and transported under police escort to a remote military range for a controlled detonation. As the sun set, the residents of the neighborhood were finally allowed to return to their homes. The police confirmed the story. The entire suburban development, built in the 1950s, was indeed located on a formerly used defense site that had been a testing range for new aerial munitions during the war. This particular Azon bomb had been a dud, a faulty unit that had been dropped during a test run and had failed to explode. It had been missed during the post-war cleanup, buried just a few feet beneath the soil, and had remained there, a silent and forgotten piece of explosive history as a peaceful neighborhood grew up around it. For Harold Watson, the day's events were a strange and unsettling collision of his lifelong passions and a forgotten, dangerous history. His dream of finding a rocket, a symbol of humanity's peaceful quest for the stars, had turned into the terrifying reality of finding a bomb, a symbol of its history of conflict. The discovery was a powerful and chilling reminder that the past is never truly buried, and that sometimes the serene, manicured lawns of our modern world are built directly on top of the explosive secrets of a forgotten war.